On November 29th, 1938, this car left the factory as a rolling chassis and went down the road to Salmons & Sons to receive its first body, which was at Tickford. Over the years, that body was long lost. There were some pieces that were saved, and the previous owner of this chassis had another chassis to which he rebuilt that entire body after hundreds of hours of labor and put it on that car. And the result was that I bought a bare rolling chassis, very similar to how it left the factory. I proceeded to assemble this car, finding as many original bits and pieces as I could. It uses an original MG engine, though not original to this chassis. This engine was available from 1939 to about the mid-50s, with the TD 1250cc engine being the last of them. That engine is highly tunable. It's got regular shell bearings, so you don't have to pour Babbitt and do a line bore every time you change the crank. It's also superchargeable, which is great. That's what makes this car fun, is we have a supercharger mounted to the front crank. Now with that combination, we have an issue. The Wilson pre-selector transmission, or gearbox as we call it, that I put on this car is not up to the task of that particular power plant combination. We have the supercharger, we have a tuned 1328cc XPEG engine. In addition, we have a cross-flow cylinder head with large intake valves. So we think we're making about 100 horsepower, which is almost double that of the original engines. This particular gearbox came from a sedan. It was a Daimler Consort. And it's possible that this gearbox is also worn out, and it's also a little bit smaller than what would have been standard in MG race cars of the day. So what we're going to do is tear this whole thing apart, because we have to get inside to that transmission, and we're going to replace it with a heavier duty unit. We have some things working in our favor in that the replacement unit is also a Wilson pre-selector box. And it has what we think are the same bell housing mounting points up front, so we don't have to do any machining to the engine plate or anything like that. The only difference is it's slightly longer because it has bigger internals. And so that puts the mount on the rear section further back about 3 inches. We don't have to re-engineer a bunch of things, but that will require making a new bracket with a mount that's a little bit further back. So I'm going to take some careful measurements before I pull all of this apart to figure out where my measuring points are, and make sure that when I put the new one in and make the mounts, that the engine comes out at the same angle that it did before, which in these cases are level, unlike the American muscle cars where the engine goes in at a slight angle to set an angle of the prop shaft. This whole setup is straight level front to back, and it might seem counterintuitive, but that's how MG did this. When I initially built this car, I was more interested in building a car than shooting YouTube videos. I didn't have my channel yet, and I wanted to get the work done. There was also the fear of the learning curve of setting up and making YouTube videos, which I've since found to be pretty easy, but at the time I wasn't willing to dig into that. So none of you got to see this whole thing from beginning to end. What I'll do in this series is I'll post a photo gallery of some of the key points in the build of this car and explain a little bit about what I did. That'll be part 1. Part 2 will be the disassembly of this thing, because I need to get the bonnet off, the radiator, the supercharger, all this front end stuff. Then the interior's got to come out. Then I pull the floors, the transmission tunnel, everything that's in my way, and that'll give me access to the transmission so I can unbolt that and then start measuring up for the new one. Let's get into the photo gallery showing how this car came together in the first place. The adventure began on June 6, 2014. Katie and I flew to Hartford, Connecticut, rented a box van, and then went a short drive to pick up the car from the previous owner. On the trip home, we stopped by the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and found Jay Leno in the car section of all places. Also, we rode the jackalopes at Wall Drug. People thought we were crazy, but we enjoyed it. Darren the Deer joined the heads at Mount Rushmore. He hung on the back wall of the cab of our truck and accompanied us across the country. Upon arrival, we stripped down TA 2962 to the bare chassis rails and then checked diagonals to make sure everything was square. Then we began the process of the build. The motor mounts that came with the engine bearer plate were not on square, so I cut those off and remade new ones after leveling the engine and checking everything. These motor mounts correspond to the later MG TD engine plate, which gives you a little bit more adjustability with positioning. These are the rear mounting points where the leaf spring passes through a tube in the chassis, and they're supposed to be bronze bushings, and you're definitely not supposed to see daylight through it. So this car would have been terrifying to drive in its last few years. After some very careful measuring and cutting, I welded on new chassis tube ends and replaced the oil-light bronze bushings, so now the leaf springs are all ready to go. Next up, I disassembled the brand new leaf springs and I chamfered the leading edges so they wouldn't scrape against one another and dig into the material. Then I added slip plate lubrication so they would slide against one another more easily. Then I wrapped them with electrical tape to keep the dirt and the rust out and the lubrication in, and finally a wrap of hemp rope. This rope was traditionally used by race car drivers to stiffen the spring rate a little bit. And lastly, I created a concoction of boiled linseed oil thinned with turpentine, hardened with Japan dryer, and then I added clove and cinnamon oil in small amounts as an antimicrobial, and then I soaked this into the hemp to prevent it from decaying when it got wet. I also got lucky and found this original Ashby steering wheel on eBay. Their claim to fame was it doesn't break your legs when you get thrown from the vehicle in an accident. And I applied the same wrapping technique with the hemp and the antimicrobial to this wheel. During this time, I also received the freshly chromed headlights back from the platers. They have a multi-piece base that's a steel ball and socket assembly that allows them to swivel for adjustment, and that's riveted onto the chrome over brass bodies. It was nerve-wracking to hammer those brass rivets in place without damaging the brass bodies, but thankfully my aim was good and they really turned out nicely. Next up, I had to create a new pedal box bracket for the dual circuit master cylinder for the brake system. Following Colin Chapman's example from Lotus cars, I added lightness by drilling some of these holes. Next up, I had to create a new chassis cross member to accept the pre-selector gearbox. This requires a slight dip down in the middle to clear the extra tall casing. Here you can see the pipes laid out on the bench top to get the right angles, and then all welded up and in place. Here's a mock-up with everything painted and bolted in place. I still have to add the bracket that the transmission mounts to on top of that cross member. Here you can see an X cross brace that I added to keep the chassis members from moving relative to one another in the forward and aft direction. Also, the little bracket with holes just in front of the handbrake lever keeps that cross shaft from flexing under load when you pull back on the handbrake. That's tied against the transmission mount bracket, which is also welded to that cross member. Here's the rear view of the car. Those disc-shaped things are Andre Hartford friction disc dampers. They serve as shock absorbers to keep the springs from continuing to oscillate. Also in place are the hydraulic lines for the brakes. With the chassis mostly sorted out, it was time to start the engine build. Here's the clean block after dipping at the machinist's. The rubber donut and the splined metal adapter in front of it allow us to put the pre-selector gearbox onto the flywheel. Notice there's no clutch pressure plate. JE pistons and Farndon connecting rods went into this engine. Also critical to a supercharged engine is this new billet crankshaft that can handle the extra torque. Connecting rods and pistons all laid out in a surgically clean environment. Here's the timing chain properly set up with the marks and the tensioner. And the pistons in the block with the timing chain cover. On January 9th, 2019, we received the shipping crate. That was exciting because it contained all these great parts, including the body shell. Okay, we've got the crate open. We're standing about where the engine would be. And on the left-hand side, you're seeing the little cowling that goes around the steering wheel for the driver. Then we're looking back toward the cockpit and to the tail. And somewhere buried, probably right under here, is the tail cone that completes this body. And then there's also, in front of us here would be the bonnet where that covers the engine. And then there's also a front supercharger cowling. And amongst other things, there should be a cylinder head and exhaust pipes and the Brooklyn's windscreens that go over the cowling there. So let's take a look. We're looking at the side compartment next to the body. And here we see the fuel tank with the twin filler caps, the exhaust pipes, exhaust manifolds sticking up. A bunch of other great stuff in here. I see the butterfly for the SU carburetor. It was great to finally hold these parts in my hand, and that meant we could continue with the engine build because now we have the manifold and the head, and now the oil pump is in place and the head is on. Lastly, we painted it up and put the exhaust on for effect. We also received quick release filler caps, SU carburetor, supercharger, and miscellaneous other brackets to go with the body kit. When I received the firewall, I thought it'd be fun to dress it up with some engine turning. This wasn't commonly used on MGs, but I thought it would look nice in this particular application. Here's what it looks like. Use an abrasive rod in a milling machine and apply overlapping swirl patterns. Today we're doing some machine turning on this firewall. This is traditionally a way to dress up a plain panel such as this. This is an aluminum piece. It had some little flaws and scratches, so I sanded everything smooth with some medium grit sandpaper just to knock down some of those little burrs and flaws. I've left the edges bare here because there'll be a cover framework around that, so we won't have to worry about getting all the way to the end. So what we have here is a 1-inch Cratex rod, and under the red tape is a hose clamp, and that pinches on the collet that we've made for this. And the Cratex is sort of a dense rubber that's impregnated with abrasive. We've got it jigged up in the table so that it runs true left and right, and the overlaps are precise so that we don't run off or go diagonal with these columns. And then we're using the table to get each of the individual movements. So we have about, I would estimate we're going to have 10 hours into this side. This is the passenger side of the firewall. So once this is complete, we'll flip it over and we'll do the engine bay side, which is one where we have to be extra careful. So I'll give you a demonstration of how this works. We're going to dial in. So we're going to go 1 turn, 2 turns, and a half, which gives us 1/2 inch. And then we'll use the manual control on this, and we'll come down and make our mark, and we'll let up. And you can see it makes another overlap. So the idea is that each circle overlaps half of the previous, and then the way that these columns offset is really up to whoever does it. You can have them come exactly straight across, or like I chose, a little bit of a diagonal offset so that you get a little bit different pattern. On the engine side, I opened the pattern up to about 600 thousandths, and I thought that looked a little more pleasing visually. I also used a more abrasive version of that rod and applied it to the steel bearer plates that hold the supercharger. And here's a test fit of the supercharger. This car involved a lot of test fitting, including seeing if I would actually fit in it. Every component was assembled and disassembled at least 3 times because you have to check for fit, then you've got to paint it, and then it's in the way of something else, so it's got to come back off. Next up, I had to make seats, and these seats aren't commercially available, so I made my own using a cardboard template to get the right profile with the body lines, and then glued up a base. After I glued the wooden bases up, I attached the hand-formed aluminum sugar scoop backs to the base, and then I sent them off to the upholsterer, my wife. With the seats worked out, I made some cardboard templates in order to fit the floorboard. I also bent my own fuel lines and brake lines and added fuel pumps and twin sediment bowl fuel filters. I restored the original chassis lubrication system that miraculously survived with this chassis, and you can see these oil lines go to the rear trunnion mounts, the handbrake, and the front trunnion mounts. Next up was the transmission tunnel. We hand formed this using an aluminum sheet over a metal pipe mounted to our cherry picker. I had a center line drawn down the middle so it wouldn't get twist, and then at the very end I clamped some steel into the bench vise and bent the bottom flanges for mounting. I also had to lay out the dashboard. I used some original pictures of MG race cars to get relative positioning of each instrument, and then laid everything out on the aluminum panel. The 4 toggle switches were mounted to a steel bar threaded to accept countersunk screws from the front, so the whole assembly can be removed for maintenance. After powder coating, I hand painted the lettering so it stood out against the background. Then it was on to headlight brackets. I made this goalpost bracket to support headlights and turn signals. Moving on to the mechanical side, I set up the differential with a brand new crown wheel and pinion gear with a 4.3:1 ratio to give a little bit higher cruising speed. I also set the backlash and replaced all the bearings and seals. The exhaust system came more or less straight, so I had to apply the bends to get around the rear wheels and to clear the body shape. You can see my dad Nick in the background. He's my #1 helper on this project, aside from my wife who would bring pizza and cookies out to us in the late nights. My dad offers fresh eyes and great perspectives on certain things that I try to do the hard way. And he's also my wiring guru, even though he's colorblind. He still does a great job, and I appreciate that. We began attaching accessories and electricals to the engine bay, trying to keep everything as clean as possible. On the upper right of your screen, you can see a pressure switch. That's a low oil pressure cutoff switch. It's tied to the ignition system, so if we lose an oil line or oil pressure, it'll cut the ignition off if it drops below 12 psi. And like a diesel locomotive, there's also a bypass so you can start and build up oil pressure. Because of the increased competition for attention by drivers who are busy on their cell phones, I added safety features including this RoboLight Model 8 that would typically be found on a mid-20s Bentley. This contains a dual filament bulb. One purpose is to flash 3 times and then stay on for brake, and the other filament stays on as a marker light when the side and tail lights are on. Here we have the dash, the floorboards, and the steering wheel fitted. And here's me understanding why it's nice to have doors, because without doors you have to go in head first and go upside down under the dash to access anything. Here's the remote gear selector for the pre-selector gearbox, along with an idle speed control and a choke cable. And finally, the car is almost ready to roll, with the supercharger cowling in place and all the bodywork on. We've got the exhaust pipes set up with heat shields to protect the electronics. I made my own brake reservoirs using these glue containers with a special lid available from the usual suppliers. Then I used water transfer decals to give them the official look. I made the brass clips for these reservoirs along with a lot of the wiring harness clips out of this 0.032-inch brass strip. And now the car is ready to go. You're looking at 40 years of MG evolution in this picture. In August 23, 2020, TA2962 finally accumulated enough parts to make its maiden voyage. This was a result of 1,800 hours of recorded labor, not including any research time. However, the car was not finished. It still needed sorting and seats. Katie used scrap leather to upholster the prototype seat, and after we settled on the design, she made the real seats out of this nice green leather. In this deal, she was able to get a sewing machine for her efforts. This is my story pole for the SU carburetor. The camera behind monitors this while I'm driving, and it tells me what position the needle is in relative to the jet while I'm driving. I took notes using an air-fuel sensor in the exhaust pipe, so I can correlate the position of the needle with the air-fuel ratio and modify the needle profile in order to let more fuel through. By spring of 2021, I'd sorted out the carburetor with the custom needle. The car will idle all day long without loading up, and at full throttle, it performs at the expected air-to-fuel ratio. Then it was time to just drive the car and keep making notes and working out bugs. We eventually showed the car at GOF West in 2021 in Welches, Oregon. They had us out on the golf green, and we were joined by our friends with the K3KN 6-cylinder supercharged MG. Here's a quick video taken by my friend Mike Brewington when he joined us for this event. This is just a quick overview of the build process. There was a lot of attention paid to details like fasteners and treatment of finishes to make sure the car looked consistent for the period. People really seem to appreciate those details, and I think that's why the car tends to hold a crowd at car shows. And that pretty much covers the assembly and build process for this car. Stay tuned for part 2, and thanks for watching.